Hey, Nate,
Yes, Sam.
did you ever play Oregon Trail when you were a kid?
Yeah, back on my old Apple II.
Wasn't it weird that people were just like dropping dead from measles and diphtheria and things like that?
Yeah, those things weren't around when I was that age.
Right, we have vaccines for most of those diseases now.
Yeah, but why do we only have to get vaccines for those once, but the flu shot we have to get every year?
And why isn't there a vaccine for things like malaria?
I don't know.
Hey, I got a question about that.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Hey, I Got a Question About That.
I'm Sam,
I'm Nate.
and this is a podcast and video series where we talk about some of the research that goes on here at the Eberly College of Science at Penn State.
Yeah, and on this episode, we traveled to the Millennium Science Complex to talk to some members of the Center for Infectious Disease Dynamics about vaccines. We got a full house here, so let's just get right into it.
All right, so we're here in the Millennium Science Complex on the Penn State University Park campus, and we're joined by Scott Lindner, who's an assistant professor of biochemistry and molecular biology, Matt Ferrari, an associate professor of biology and statistics, and Troy Sutton, who's an assistant professor of veterinary and biomedical sciences. So thanks for joining us, Scott. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, my name is Scott Lindner. I'm an assistant professor of biochemistry and molecular biology. I think about the malaria parasite. It's a huge global health burden even today. And because we don't have an effective licensed vaccine yet, and the parasite is really clever and finds ways around each drug that we've ever deployed, it's still important to find ways that we can target it therapeutically. So my group thinks about how this parasite transmits from humans to mosquitoes and back again. And then what are the weak points that might be targetable?
Great, thanks. And Matt, can you tell us a little bit about your research?
Sure, yeah. So I'm a quantitative epidemiologist. So that means I use mathematics and statistics to try and come up with numbers, calculations, measures that can help us understand what the burden of disease is, so how much disease is out there in the world, and what the magnitude of interventions and changes are. So how much disease is out there right now. If we introduce a new drug or vaccine or what have you, right? How much do we expect things to improve in the future? And did we achieve that expectation, right? And that might seem like a trivial thing. You might say, oh, you can just go out to the hospitals and count up how many sick people there are, right? Right? Well, even in the US where there are electronic medical records, going out and doing that would be really hard and time consuming. Right? But if you go across the world where you have lots of paper-based records and lots of people are getting sick in the home and not being seen by health systems, all of a sudden you can start to see the complexity of that problem. And I love that complexity, and I do all kinds of stuff to try and figure out how to solve it.
And Troy, why don't you tell us what it is that you do?
So I'm a virologist, and my research focuses on the influenza virus, or viruses. And we basically do two things. I'm interested in two questions. One is, how do viruses that live in animals transmit into humans and then transmit from human to human? And that's how we get a pandemic. So my lab is interested in that question. And then we're interested in making better flu vaccines. So specifically, we try and engineer vaccines, engineer flu viruses so that they are weakened, they don't cause disease, but they induce a better immune response. So we're trying to engineer a better flu vaccine.
So Nate and I were talking a little bit about vaccines, what they are, how they work. And I guess a way to get started is maybe you can tell us a little bit about what a vaccine is and how do they work.
So I'm going to answer your question in the reverse order.
Okay.
I'm going to explain to you how they work in order to explain what they do. Okay? So there are many different types of pathogens that can make you sick. Bacteria, parasites, viruses. And when you're exposed to one of these pathogens, your body develops an immune response that seeks to remove it from your body. That immune response consists of what we call antibodies. These are proteins that coat that pathogen and sort of inactivate it. And then there's what we call a cellular immune response, which is basically cells that are trained to recognize other cells in the body that are infected. And they target those cells for removal. And so after you're exposed the first time, when you're exposed to a pathogen the second time, your body develops this really robust immune response and clears it very quickly. So
Is this happening in the bloodstream?
this happens in different parts of the body, depending on where the pathogen is infecting you or growing. Right, so when you see a pathogen the second time, you already have these antibodies and these cells ready to go, and they develop this really robust response and they clear it very quickly. So a vaccine works by basically tricking your body into thinking it's being infected the first time, so that you develop this response, and then when you see it the second time, in real life, you develop this really robust response and you're protected from getting sick.
What kind of impact does this have on public health, having access to vaccines?
Yeah, well, as you can imagine, I mean, basically, it effectively creates a system in which people are already practiced and their bodies are already practiced and trained at removing these pathogens. So you see a dramatic reduction in the level of infections, the amount of infection that's out there, the number of people that are carrying these bugs, viruses, bacteria, what have you. That therefore reduces the ability of those people to transmit to anybody else. Right? So not only are the vaccinated people protected, but anybody else that they could transmit to is now protected because there's nobody to pass the bug on. Right? So just those are the sort of basic principles of how vaccines scale up and affect populations overall. Everybody always wants to know, well, what are the numbers associated with that, right? I mean, how many people are affected or hurt or saved by these things? Actually, it's a really challenging question to answer, right? It's because you're asking about how do you count up the number of things that didn't happen, right? And that's actually it's a huge part of my research program is trying to figure out thoughtful and well-informed, data-informed ways of trying to calculate that, right? So what we talk about is often in terms of lives saved, right? How many deaths were averted by vaccines, and the WHO. And a bunch of other partners who put in place what's called the Decade of Vaccines, which is a big effort to increase the amount of vaccine and access to vaccines over the last decade from 2010 to 2020. Right? They've estimated that in the first half of that, over 10 million children's lives have been saved just over the first 5 years, over 2010 to 2015. And the expectation is that over the second 5 years, that number is going to go up even more. Partially because there are more children in the world, right? But also because all of those programs that were ramping up in the first 5 years are now going to see even more benefit over the second half of that period.
So this all sounds like good things. Why do some people choose to not vaccinate themselves or their kids?
Yeah, it's a really complicated question, and there are lots and lots of possible reasons that are out there, right? I actually spend most of my time working in low and middle income countries where the primary reason that people don't get vaccinated is because they don't have access to healthcare or health services in the first place. They live in remote areas or they're far from where vaccines can get to. Many vaccines require big infrastructure, what we call the cold chain. So the vaccine has to stay tracked and cold and within a special temperature regime from production to injection or delivery to a child. And in areas where road access is poor or electricity access is poor, right, it's hard to do that. And so there's only a small number of places where vaccines can even get to, and that limits the ability of people to access that. So globally, access and the inability to get to a vaccine is probably the biggest reason that people don't get vaccinated.
Those aren't a problem here in the U.S., and we still have people who don't vaccinate their kids or don't get vaccinated.
Yeah, that's right, of course. So, and let's just be clear. It is still a problem in the U.S. There are lots of people that don't have access to health care in the United States, both because of where they live geographically or because of economic limitations, right? So access is still an important part of the story in the United States. But there also are lots of other reasons that people don't get vaccinated themselves or don't vaccinate their children, right? I mean, without a doubt, a vaccination is a medical intervention. Every medical intervention has side effects and extra things that can happen, right? As Troy mentioned, right, what you're doing is you're kind of tricking the body into stimulating, into generating this protective immune response, right? Well, when your body is tricked into doing that, sometimes you exhibit some of the symptoms of a natural infection. Not nearly as bad, but things like a slight fever might be associated with that. You might get a little bit of redness or a bump at the site of the injection, right? Or a little bit of a rash or something, right? So those are really benign side effects that can happen associated with that, but they can be quite frightening to a parent with a young child, right? So a lot of people are concerned about that. there are, in very rare cases, more severe side effects. Some people are allergic to components that go into vaccines, and if they haven't been exposed to them yet, by that point in their life, they didn't know they were allergic to it, and you can have a more severe reaction, right? Those kinds of things can scare parents, and those parents tell other parents, and so you can generate a lot of fear and confusion associated with that. So with any medical intervention, you have these challenges, right? That fear has been capitalized on by lots of other people to generate more significant phenomena, what's referred to as the anti-vaccination movement, that has led to this sort of big multiplying of an effect, right? And people avoiding vaccines for conceivably irrational reasons.
So where does this anti-vaxx movement come from?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Well, anti-vaccination sentiment and fear of vaccinations has existed since the first vaccine was developed. The original vaccine, the first vaccine, which was developed is smallpox. There's a lot, all of a sudden, this is a new medical intervention, and people were really freaked out, right? The idea that you would take a healthy person and put a piece of an infectious agent into that person to protect them, that was blowing a lot of people's minds at the time, and it wasn't widespread, and people hadn't seen the benefit from it yet. So there's been fear of vaccination ever since vaccination started, right? The modern anti-vaccination movement has its roots in a British doctor called Andrew Wakefield, who was himself working on some novel vaccines and ultimately falsified experimental data and published it in one of the most respected medical journals at the time, and actually still one of the most respected medical journals. And he published falsified data showing a connection between the current vaccines and autism. And that fear and the concern about that just really resonated with a lot of the population, and it has spread and continued to spread and continued to be reinforced by people all over the place, especially some sort of high-profile celebrities and things that have really kept this thing as part of this sort of public zeitgeist. And despite the fact that this work has been completely debunked, this guy, Wakefield, had his medical license revoked, the paper was revoked by the journal, all of that has been completely shown to be false. However, once that idea was out there and started festering, it's unfortunately continued to circulate. And what that means is, even if it's relatively small percentages, right, small percentages of huge populations, right, actually mean that you have large numbers of children and even adults at some point, sometimes, that are unprotected from this. And those adults can then get sick, and those adults can then transmit onwards to others, right? And so you actually have this multiplicative effect when you even have relatively small numbers of people in the population that are unprotected.
So if vaccines work by kind of tricking the immune system by giving pieces of a pathogen or something like that, why don't they cause people to get sick?
So the answer to that is more complicated than a straightforward answer, but vaccines are formulated in different ways, right? So there are basically three major formulations. One is you grow a pathogen and then you kill it. And you do that with chemicals or with heat, and you show that it's dead, so it's not like that, and then you give it to the body. So you're getting all of the different parts of it that look like a pathogen to the body, but you are not actually getting the agent that can replicate. So you're getting all the parts of it, and so that's why you can get this weak immune response, but you're not actually really getting sick, because that's why you can get these weak symptoms like fever, and that's why you're not getting sick. There are other forms of vaccines where you take that whole inactivated virus and you purify parts of it, so you're only giving one part of it, so that obviously isn't capable of making you sick. Or using more modern techniques, we can actually just express one part of a pathogen and give that. The other form of vaccines are what we call live attenuated vaccines. This is where you've taken a pathogen and intentionally weakened it. So you've made a pathogen that is no longer capable of that is capable of infecting you, but no longer capable of making you sick. And so those are very effective vaccines. They are used. So basically, we take steps to make sure that they don't make you sick.
And actually, just to follow up on that, one of the most famous and influential vaccines around the world has been the oral polio vaccine, which was a attenuated polio virus. And the fact that it was live attenuated is part of why it's been so successful in the world. Because what happens is you give it to a child, and that child, it replicates inside that child and in fact transmits to other children. It doesn't make you sick, but it transmits to other children, and other children then effectively get vaccinated, right? Through an infectious process. And especially in remote parts of the world and low-income parts of the world where getting vaccines to kids has been a real challenge, right? That mechanism of the vaccine has actually really amplified and increased the effect of that vaccine, broadly speaking.
So what makes a vaccine effective?
So there's actually several parts to making a vaccine effective. So you need to your vaccine itself has to induce an immune response. So it has to have the right mix of stuff to make you actually think you're being infected. And then, I alluded to you need to induce antibodies, or your immune response consists of antibodies and specialized cells, or a cellular immune response. You need to induce both those components. The added layer in there is that depending on what pathogen you're infected with and where it lives in the body, you're going to need either more antibodies or more of an antibody response or more of a cell-based response. So if you're infected with a pathogen that lives outside of cells, you're going to need antibodies. Antibodies exist in cavities, they exist in the blood, they exist at your mucosal surfaces. They coat the pathogen and prevent it from infecting other cells, or they target it for removal. If you have something like a virus that lives inside a cell, you're going to need this cellular immune response, where these cells are trained to recognize other cells that are infected and kill them. So you need an immune response, you need the right balance of antibodies and cells, and then the other thing you need it in the right place. So if you have a respiratory infection, you need an immune response in your respiratory cavities. If you're going to be exposed by something that lives in the blood, you need an immune response in the blood. So you need an immune response, it needs to be the right balance, and it needs to be in the right place.
And then once you've developed an effective vaccine, gone through all this efforts, put in all the money, and identified the best way to make these vaccines, you need to educate the people that should receive them. We talked about the anti-vaxx movement. It's important that they understand, what a vaccine is and what it isn't. Part of what we're, saying here is hopefully to inspire people to be well informed. But going out into low and middle income countries and hopefully partnering with people from that country to educate their common countrymen about the benefits, educating against misinformation, so that people are willing to get the vaccine is also another major component. And then once you have buy-in from the community, as Matt was saying, getting it distributed, if it has to stay cold, keeping it cold. But then if you need multiple doses, making sure that people come back. It's hard enough, just remembering to take a multivitamin every day, let alone, telling somebody, come back in 3 months, and making sure that they come back on time, right?
Right. And you need a production system, a supply chain. You need companies that are willing to manufacture this vaccine at the scale that you need, right? You need, some of these vaccines, we're vaccinating almost every child that's born across the planet. So we need massive, massive quantities of these things. So you need huge infrastructure to produce these things. You have to have negotiated pricing so that the prices don't get too high for people to not be able to afford them, but also not get too low that the companies aren't willing to produce them, right? And so you have to find a balance between them. And there's actually, outside of the biology of vaccines, there's a huge public health infrastructure that's trying to find that balance and work out that negotiation, both between countries that are going to be purchasing vaccine, NGOs that are going to help support financing of this thing, and the companies themselves that are producing these things.
So vaccines are safe, they're effective. Why don't we have vaccines kind of for everything?
Yeah, so each bug is different, so we need to put in the legwork to understand what are its vulnerabilities, what can we target, what is useful when we're generating an immune response. But ultimately, there's some pathogens, viruses, bacteria, parasites as well, that some change very slowly, some change very quickly. So the vaccines that we already have for things like flu can be effective for a short period of time, but then the flu virus will change quickly. So we need to adjust what vaccine we're deploying. Versus other things like measles change slowly. So the vaccine that we get as a kid can help us throughout our life. So ultimately it comes down to a race between the pathogen and our immune system to know what we need to do. And best of all or worst of all, depending on how you look at it, we need to know how to customize that for each pathogen that's relevant to us.
So were vaccines always safe?
So that's a good question, and it's part of where some of these myths about vaccination originated from. So vaccines were first developed in the late 1700s, and very early on, people didn't know what they were doing. They didn't have modern safety, biomedical practices, the research facilities, and there were no laws around it. So people were being vaccinated with live virus from other people, with all sorts of things. So early on, they weren't that safe. Some of the better scientists, Edward Jenner, who invented the smallpox vaccine, they did it in a more controlled fashion, but they still did things that by today's standards were very risky. So as the vaccine field has developed and as biomedical research has developed, we've gotten better at quality control, ensuring viruses are inactivated, and now today's modern vaccines are very safe. And the level of testing to develop a new vaccine is incredibly rigorous. So modern vaccines, if you come up with a new vaccine, the first thing that's done is they're put in healthy adults to make sure that they don't make anybody sick in a small group. And then that's scaled up to another study where there are more adults that show that the first and foremost, they don't make you sick, they don't cause any adverse, really terrible side effects. And then from there on, they start getting into these larger, really expensive studies. And in all of these studies, even when you're at hundreds of thousands of people, the reporting requirements for side effects and the reporting requirements to license a vaccine on the side of a company are very exhaustive, and they're very thoroughly vetted. So the history of vaccines early on, they were not incredibly safe, but today's modern vaccines are very safe.
So the kind of anti-vaccination movement is in some ways irrational, as you mentioned. Like, how can we kind of deal with that fear and get people to overcome it, I guess?
Yeah. The simple answer, I think, is education. But education, is a complicated phenomenon, and it's a complicated process. So this whole thing is really hard. Frankly, fear is not irrational, right? The fact that parents are fearful for their children and worry about their children, that's not in and of itself irrational, right? And we have these, there are fundamental challenges about when vaccines are delivered to children. We want to vaccinate children early on in their lives so that they're protected as soon as possible, right? Especially because some of these infections, some of these diseases are disproportionately severe in the youngest kids. So we want to get them early on, right? That's also a time when there are lots of developmental changes happening in those kids. And you're just starting to see all the things that those kids can do. They're starting to walk for the first time and talk for the first time and exhibit all of these new behaviors and characteristics that you've never seen before. And so those are also the first times where you can notice that there are developmental disabilities, that that something is not quote unquote normal, in whatever the conventional characterization of normal is. And so that unfortunate timing of when vaccines are given and when you start to notice symptoms of these developmental challenges basically means that every child is an experiment without a replicate. And it's fundamentally impossible to fully disentangle that. And that's the communications challenge that the scientific community has, right? Because we can show, and we have shown throughout multiple studies, that there is no causative link. That there's just no, physiological, biological link that says if I put this compound in an individual, then this outcome will happen, right? That this deleterious or negative outcome will happen. We've shown that many, many, many times, right? But there's this fundamental challenge of timing, right? That they just happen because of the way we do things to happen in that sequence, and it sure looks like to a parent, right? That one thing causes the other, and so unfortunately we need to train parents to think like scientists, and the idea of giving every parent a PhD in epidemiology is far too absurd, right? But we need to, the level of education that's necessary to process that, right, is quite high level. And trying to develop concise communication methods that can communicate really complicated ideas to parents is something that we haven't quite mastered yet, right? And it's something that only in the last few years we really recognized how severe that phenomenon can be and how severe that challenge can be in limiting our ability to control these diseases.
And I think, part of the political spectrum with the anti-vaccine movement coming up, early on there was this real butting heads. And I think the scientific community has had to change and acknowledge that these fears are there, and acknowledge that the dialogue has to happen. You have to acknowledge the fear and recognize that these are legitimate concerns of parents. And so the scientific community and the medical community has had to change their approach as well, which has been a certain part of addressing that fear. So that is a piece that is changing as well.
That's right. And so we have to educate ourselves as well as scientists. We have to learn new skills. We have to learn to be communicators, not just scientists, right? Just doing the study isn't enough. We have to take that information and get that to parents so that they can really understand what it is that we know.
Yeah, and just like the anti-vaccination campaign has spread from parent to parent, we as scientists that also happen to be parents can be a part of the counter to that. So we can say, I'm a scientist, I know how vaccines work. I vaccinate my kid, it's safe, right? So we can also be a part of the solution, in that way for those that, are both scientists with PhDs and parents.
And I think there's another important part to vaccination is that a vaccine's goal is to basically render itself useless. If you vaccinate to a level where these diseases are no longer prevalent, people no longer see them as a threat. Right? So if you have the option between giving your child measles or if you're giving your child a vaccine that prevents measles or having your child get measles, you're going to go for the vaccine. But if you never see a child getting measles, you're not going to see the need to justify vaccinating your child, especially if there are these myths being propagated about vaccination being harmful. So that is a piece that we really need to educate on and really explain that these vaccines or these viruses, these pathogens still exist and still cause disease and have a public health burden. And we see examples of that in the news with measles outbreaks happening in the US and other things like that. So we have to remember that a vaccine's goal is to be so good it's no longer needed.
So why do I have to get a flu vaccine every year?
Yeah, so flu's a tricky virus. Flu viruses, as Scott alluded to, mutate very quickly. Right? So in response to having people that have immunity against them, the flu virus changes quickly and it develops so that it actually escapes that immunity. So within a year or within every 1 to 3 years, that virus is substantially different than the previous virus and has actually evolved to escape the immunity that you have. The answer is a bit more complicated than that. There are most flu vaccines have 4 different flu viruses in them, and so each flu virus in a given year, a different strain predominates. So you want to get vaccinated to make sure you're covered against that strain, and as well, all 4 of those strains are also changing. So it's sort of a 2-layered problem.
So does the flu vaccine actually, it works just like all the other vaccines in that it protects you for life against the old flu. Just that there might be a new flu, just that next year is going to be a new flu.
So flu vaccination, as we learn more and more about it, your predominant immune response to flu vaccine is against the first flu virus you ever saw. Mm-hmm. So when you see a flu virus, the majority of your antibodies and cells are actually against the virus that you saw the first time, and only a subset are against the new virus that you got vaccinated against. So the theory is that you have lifelong immunity against the viruses that you've been exposed to. The viruses keep changing, and you do continue to mount that lifelong immunity, but you have to get sort of updated against those newer viruses. Yeah.
What about something like malaria? That's such a huge kind of global health issue, and it's attracted the attention of Bill and Melinda Gates and things like that. Why haven't we developed a vaccine for that?
Yeah, so I'm a parasitologist, so I have my bias, I have my preference of what I like to work on. Parasites are eukaryotes, so they're more complicated, they're bigger, they encode more things on their own than, say, a virus, which encodes a handful of different proteins that you need to worry about. So the malaria parasite is caused by Plasmodium, and the Plasmodium that you'll find in Africa or in Southeast Asia or in South America is wildly different. So developing a vaccine could work, and at least in clinical trials, it's working well against the one type that the vaccine was based upon, right? But if you try to use that vaccine and try to protect against geographically different parasites, it's not going to work very well. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is it's a really clever beast. So there have been efforts to make a vaccine. GlaxoSmithKline, I think, put in $500 million so far, along with other folks contributing to make this vaccine called RTSS, which WHO has put its stamp of approval on, and it's going out to 3 different countries right now in Africa. It's moderately protective. Maybe 40% protective. Maybe you won't get malaria right now, but it'll delay when you get that next malaria infection. That's not great. Everybody has much higher goals, but getting to that point is challenging. So Troy was mentioning that you can use parts of the pathogen, like some proteins, or you can use the whole pathogen. And when it comes to the malaria parasite, if you just give some proteins, it's kind of protective. That's what the RTSS vaccine is all about, using a few proteins, in fact, just one protein from one part of its life cycle, and it provides some protection. There's new vaccines on the horizon that are really encouraging and exciting that are these live attenuated pathogens, parasites, where you weaken them, they can still infect you, they don't cause any symptoms, but then they arrest, they die, and then your immune system can detect everything in there and provide really excellent coverage from an immune response standpoint. The issue, though, is, as it stands right now, the vaccine either has to be delivered by a mosquito, so you're not actually using a pill or an injectable. In the past few years, we, as a field, understood that if you inject it into a vein, that also works. But if you then think about going out into the fields, you need to have qualified people that know how to do this. So these are new barriers, new hurdles that are being overcome. But factor into how on earth are we going to deploy a vaccine when we have an effective one.
Okay, so what do you think it's going to take to eradicate malaria?
Yeah, so bottom line, a lot of cooperation. So we're going to need a direct vaccine like what I was describing previously, something that will protect me. If I get a vaccine, it's going to protect me. We're also, I think, going to need an altruistic vaccine, where if I get a vaccine, it's not going to protect me, but it's going to make sure that mosquitoes that bite me if I'm infected can't become infected and then pass it on to you, right? So those two things are going to be really important. As we said before, education, getting out there and informing people as to what we're trying to do, how this direct vaccine is going to help me, how this altruistic vaccine is going to help your neighbors, and then finally the distribution network. How do we get it out to the people that need it? And all these are big hurdles that we're overcoming.
Yeah. And for a problem as complicated as malaria, even so, a vaccine is going to be one part of a much larger systematic approach or system-wide approach to getting rid of this thing. So conventional things like distributing bed nets so that people don't get bit while they're sleeping, some insecticides and things that will kill mosquitoes, right? Things like that also, and general education as well. Right? All of those things can work then to amplify the impact that a novel therapeutic or a novel vaccine can have.
Yeah, and then finally, cooperation across geopolitical lines. Mosquitoes, don't care about an imaginary line on a map, right? They're going to fly across. So neighboring countries need to participate, understand that working together is in everybody's benefit. And of course, anything political is a huge challenge, and it's going to require a lot of organization, a lot of effort from NGOs and organizations like Bill and Melinda Gates, World Health Organization, et cetera.
So given all this, what do you think is the kind of outlook for the future of developing new vaccines and making sure that the vaccines that we have are properly deployed and get to as much of the globe as possible?
With respect to the malaria vaccine, the outlook's great. There's really exciting, encouraging new vaccine candidates that are right on the horizon. We think that they're going to be highly protective. But again, if you're making a vaccine from one parasite that comes from Africa, is it going to protect very well against parasites that are in Southeast Asia or South America? So there's going to be a lot more effort that's needed to make these multi-strain vaccines. And we're already on it. So people in my field are already appreciating that this is the next major milestone, and this is where they're heading. So within our lifetimes, that's what I anticipate will happen, that we'll have an effective malaria vaccine.
Honestly, over the short term, I think the biggest and most exciting developments are boring industrial operational things, right? How do you get it out there? How do you improve supply chains? How do you improve the delivery? Changing from needle-based vaccines to vaccines that effectively work like a Band-Aid that you can put on the skin, right? Those vaccines are actually, those products are actually in development. I've held them in my hands now. Getting them to scale where you can deploy them to hundreds of millions of people, that's a really hard problem. But I think those are solvable problems. And once we can get those dealt with, then we can benefit from all the existing vaccines that have saved lots of lives in places with good access, and get that out to the rest of the world that's been missing it. So those are some of the real short-term benefits that you can have with vaccines, right? There's a really interesting long-term horizon view of vaccines. As Troy mentioned, vaccines, really what they do is they trick your body into protecting itself without ever seeing a given disease, right? And that's almost magical that happens and that works. And there's some really exciting research being done in all kinds of fields, even things like cancer, where people are trying to harness that concept of vaccines, basically training the body to be better at protecting itself from various different kinds of diseases. Those are the real sort of long horizon, over multiple decades kind of moonshot things that vaccines could do in the future, right? It's going to take a lot of research and a lot of time to get there, but I think this concept is really, really powerful and has a lot of potential.
So I would mirror that I think the future of vaccination is very bright, and I think the field of vaccinology is very optimistic. Companies are putting a lot more money into these vaccines. There was a period where they were scaling back. Now they're full tilt into it. And like you alluded, there's cancer vaccines on the horizon. So there are lots of new applications. In my own field, flu vaccination, we recognize the vaccine isn't perfect. It isn't totally effective, and the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases has made it part of their goal is to make a better flu vaccine that is more effective, protects you against more strains, and maybe even protects you against pandemics, so that you have this pie-in-the-sky vaccine that would be protective. So the funding bodies and the companies are looking at vaccination as a future, and I think the future is very bright, and obviously the impact on public health is huge.
That's fantastic. It's a great way to end, I think. So thank you all for joining us. That was cool.
Yeah, I never realized that there's such an infrastructure needed to get these vaccines, sent around the world.
And I thought they made a really good point when they talked about how education and communication are going to be really vital in making sure that people understand how important vaccinations are.
So if you want to learn more about any of the research that we talked about today, we'll have links in the show notes below.
So thanks for joining us on another episode of Hey, I Got a Question About That. If you haven't already, please check out our previous episodes. You can find them wherever you get podcasts and on YouTube. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.
All right, Mom. It's time for bed, kids. Just one more round.
Right.
I don't think if we stopped and rest that it cured anybody. Like, was there a doctor in your caravan? Or are you just literally stopping and resting? Oh, the measles went away. Yeah, but the whole 6 people that listen to this probably know what Oregon Trail is.
Give me a second to compose myself or something. Let's start recording for real.
Mom.
I just now imagine every time I utter something stupid, but it's in the pod.
We had a full house in this episode, and then Danny Tanner comes in. Cut it out.
Not only that viruses are safe, but how important they are.
You said viruses are safe.
Podcast and video series where we talk a lot about.
Oh, now we're mumble rappers.
This is a podcast and video series where we talk about. My.
Hey, Sam, you messed up.